New York Democrats have been hyper-focused on two firearm strategies. Now, the first has been to create a registry of gun owners in the state of New York with all the pertinent information that would be needed should a confiscation be desired by the gun-grabbing legislature and or state police. The New York State Legislature has decided that any gun purchases that occur in the state of New York will go directly through the New York State Police. However, the originally appointed Governor Hochul was not completely happy with firearm background checks alone and added an ammo background check rule as well. Now, the second strategy is the use of extreme risk protection orders, also known as red flag laws, also known as gun confiscation without due process. In 2023, Judge Craig Stephen Brown declared New York's red flag law unconstitutional on the grounds that a court is not equipped to determine mental health issues. He also made it known that the ex parte confiscation of guns without due process is a violation of constitutional rights. So why is New York so intent on putting a gun registry and red flag law in place? Well, the answer is simple. Before you can confiscate firearms, you must first know the home addresses where they're located. Red flag laws are the confiscation tool that eliminates that pesky due process, and the registry is the location tool. Recently, a New York appellate court upheld the controversial and dangerous red flag law. Justification for the court's decision relied on the notion that a judge can make a determination on an individual that could be potentially a risk. Now, if the judge believes that there's probable cause that a subject of a red flag petition is likely to cause serious harm to himself, herself, or others, the confiscation would be given a green light. So we're going to talk about this with Cam Edwards. He's the editor for Bearing Arms. He's a national gun rights spokesperson, award-winning journalist, and all-around authority on Second Amendment issues. Cam, so proud and so thankful to have you on the show.
Hey, Dan, thanks for the invite.
Well, so I figured if we're going to talk about red flag laws and gun laws, we should talk to the master of this stuff himself. And obviously, you've been around, you've been doing a great job with this, and you are an authority on this stuff. So, tell us what's happening. I guess explain what red flag laws are, what the registries are in New York, and how this is all working together.
Sure. So the idea of a red flag law or extreme risk protection order goes back really over 20 years now, right? I think it was Indiana and Connecticut were the first two states to put red flag laws in place. And they were 1999, 2000, 2001. The idea back then was that this was going to be a tool that law enforcement could use that was going to be pretty rare, right, in execution. And it was going to stop those who were, who pose an immediate risk of harm to themselves or others. This was primarily a suicide prevention tool. That's what it was billed as back then. Since then, of course, we have seen the use of red flags expanded. Now it's in New York, as you brought up. Governor Hochul has told the state police, listen, basically anytime you make an arrest, or you don't even have to make an arrest, anytime you believe that an ERPO order would be useful, you apply for one of those red flag petitions, right? So we've seen thousands of red flag petitions filed in New York State.
So Cam, let me interrupt you for a second on that New York one. So what that means, correct me if I'm wrong, is that now the police essentially don't really have that ability to make that determination at this point. Is that what it sounds like?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly with the New York State Police, Governor Hochul can't demand that local law enforcement or county sheriffs do this, but she's certainly encouraging them to file as many red flag petitions as possible. And it's gotten to the point, Dan, I know that you're aware of this, the New York State Police have actually run out of room to house all of the guns that they have confiscated, which, by the way, begs the question, how secure are these firearms, right? Would they be better off in the homes of these original gun owners, or are they going to be stolen from a police department somewhere? So that was the original intent, right? Was this is going to be a suicide prevention tool. And, a lot of times people will call red flag laws mental health laws. These are not mental health laws. They have nothing to do with mental health. In fact, that was one of the findings of this New York appellate court, right? Is that, well, a judge isn't making a determination about somebody's mental health, so you don't need to involve mental health professionals. The judge is just trying to decide whether or not there's probable cause that somebody might pose a danger to themselves or others. And so that's why this appellate court, one of the reasons why this appellate court said, this is fine, despite these due process concerns. So it's really, the use of these, the intent of these laws has certainly expanded over the past couple of decades. Whether or not these laws are actually effective at reducing suicide, I think is still very much an open question. There have really only been a couple of studies done. One study found that in the years after Indiana's red flag law was put in place, there was a modest reduction in suicide. But when they looked at Connecticut, what they found was that while there was a decline in gun-related suicides, the overall suicide rate still increased.
Yeah,
which makes sense, Dan, because again, we're talking about a gun, right? This is not about mental health. This is not about suicide prevention, because it does nothing to help the supposedly dangerous individual. It takes their guns away and then says, all right, problem solved.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because there were two major gun confiscations in Australia, and they were done under the guise of stopping suicide, right? But the trajectory of suicides in Australia after the gun bans, the trajectories didn't change. Nothing. It didn't stop, because when people want to do something like that, they'll find the means. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. And this also doesn't touch, one of the red flag laws that, or one of the red flag petitions that was highlighted, I think it was the New York Times, did a story a couple of months ago talking about the expanded use of red flag laws. And one of the petitions that was filed was a guy who had threatened his family with an axe. So in this case, you're going to take this guy's ability to legally purchase a firearm away, but he can still get an axe, right? Yeah. He can still get the very implement that he used to threaten to kill his family. So that, to me, I think is a perfect example of how these laws are off base. We're not even getting into the Second Amendment aspect of this, right? The constitutional right to keep and bear arms. I'm just talking about this from a pragmatic perspective. Do red flag laws do what they're supposed to do? And the answer is no. They don't help dangerous people become less dangerous. They don't address the suicidal ideation or the homicidal ideation of an individual. Again, take whatever legally owned firearms they might have away from them. And then as far as the law is concerned, the problem is solved. I don't think that that's the case.
John, did you have a question?
No, I agree. It's exactly how it is. We've talked about it so often that the gun is the gun and the person is the person. And I just think so many people on the left just don't have any way of looking at these situations like, here's a starting point. Here's the idea we're going to use and put into play. What does it do? They never want to run through that process. It's all intentions.
Like, right? What are the actual results?
Right. They don't measure the results. How do you manage it if you don't measure it? We don't know what any of this stuff does. Because I know gun-free zones pretty much give people a place to go and shoot.
Right.
But it's crazy. But yeah,
yep.
Good info.
So I guess then, yeah, Cam, you said exactly what I was thinking. I mean, it's so obvious. To us anyway, at least because we're in this conversation all the time. But my next fear, if you will, is the gun registries. I mean, now we have a couple states, New York and California, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, I don't know if there's any more, who are actually now trying to do ammo background checks and taking it away from the NICS system, where we were supposed to have some kind of protection through the federal NICS system, taking it into their own state police. That kind of removes any protection for anonymity that we would have normally had. No?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. And California and New York are the two states that, Connecticut, I believe, also requires background checks on ammo sales. But again, we're talking about just a handful of states. But this is a major push for the gun control groups, right? USA Today had a big investigative piece last week about online ammo sales and how supposedly they're not doing, age verification. All that is a story that is designed to give blue state lawmakers an excuse to say, oh, well, look, we got to ban online ammo sales. We have to require that everybody purchasing ammunition in our state go to an FFL, go through a background check, even though the NICS system is not set up to do this, right? So you're going to have to create a whole new state system to run these background checks. And again, from a practical standpoint, these things are failing. I don't know, Dan, you're probably in a better position to tell me than I am to tell our audience here. But at last I checked, there were still massive delays and false denials in New York for people who were trying to buy ammunition.
Well, that's another thing. Of course, is the false positives of all the denials. It's something like 95% of all denials are false positives. So there, right there, you got a problem. But then, as far as delays, I mean, I'm talking to other guys in New York who are in other gun rights groups and stuff here in New York, and they're saying, and gun shops, and they're saying that there's up to like 9 days or more. I think the most I heard was like 2 weeks to get your background check to buy a box of 9mm bullets.
And the same thing's happening in California. I think there's a lawsuit underway, Rody versus Bonna. And I think the plaintiff said, I think actually Judge Benitez, in striking down this law, and his decision has been stayed by the Ninth Circuit, but when he struck down California's ammo background check law, he said that these background checks had stopped, I think it was maybe 200 prohibited persons from buying ammunition. But at the same time, there were more than 50,000 false denials. Yeah. Right. So think about that for a second. I mean, how many thousands of gun owners are being told, no, you can't buy that box of 9mm. You can't buy that box of 223 because you're a prohibited person, even though they're not. It might be a case of, their address on their ID not matching their address in the state's database. And all of a sudden now they're prohibited from purchasing ammunition. This has I believe, an intentionally chilling effect on our right to keep and bear arms. This is about, at best, this is about making it more difficult and more burdensome to exercise our Second Amendment rights. At worst, as you say, this is about coming up with a list of everybody who would purchase ammunition. So now the state knows, well, even if we don't have a gun registry, right, we have a registry, an informal registry of everybody who's purchased ammunition. Well, that's a good place to start if we decide to go after the guns.
And we've got the red flag laws as the vehicle to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is this 1-2 punch, right? And of course, again, when we talk about the red flag laws, originally these laws, if you had to file a petition, you had to go to law enforcement, right? You had to go to the police. They had to determine whether or not there was a valid complaint. Now you've got states like California and New York opening up the petition process to virtually anybody. Somebody you once dated, if you were a neighbor, a former teacher, a former employee, as easy as possible to file these petitions, as difficult as possible to defend yourself against the complaints.
Yeah. And New York State red flag law has a little, it's kind of built around schools and stuff like that. They got a lot of verbiage in there about schools and how, what do they say? What do they call them? Like official school officials or whatever can enact or can request a petition for red flag. So that means like anybody who certified, I think was the word, certified school workers. And that means like a substitute teacher. A substitute teacher can come in and say, well, little Johnny's a little aggressive on the playground. He beat up another kid or he got in a fight or whatever. We think he might be a risk. And so this substitute teacher can essentially do a petition to have a red flag law where Big Johnny's guns are confiscated from his house because his kid gets in a fight. Stuff like this could happen, and that's the stuff that I'm kind of concerned with.
Absolutely. You also have the issue of government retaliation. There's a lawsuit underway that the Second Amendment Foundation is involved in Maryland. There was a Maryland resident who had this sort of ongoing dispute with officials in his county. They were, your grass is too high, your lawn is too cluttered, things of that nature. Yeah. And eventually one of these county officials filed an ERPO petition to try to have his guns seized. And he went through the initial ex parte hearing. And I think he was actually subjected to a 72-hour mental health hold where it was determined, no, he's not a danger to himself or anybody else. Eventually, that petition was withdrawn under the threat of perjury, right?
But he had to go through all of it. But he had to go through it all, right?
Absolutely. This guy's life was turned upside down, basically because of government retaliation, because this was a tool that some bureaucrat could use against somebody that she didn't like. And so, I think this is actually a really good vehicle to challenge these red flag laws. I know that the case in New York is likely to be appealed. But I think we're really just in the early stages of litigating these types of laws around the country. And when we can document these abuses because we know that they're taking place. There was another case in Colorado where a woman whose son was shot and killed by law enforcement filed a red flag petition against the police officer who shot her son. Now, this was a justified shooting. This guy was, I believe he was armed at the time. And mom, obviously grieving, but decided, that she was going to lash out at this officer. So she filed a red flag petition. Now, in that case, she was actually charged and convicted of filing a false report. But that's the exception. That's not the rule. I think there are far more guardrails in these red flag laws that are designed to enable these petitions being filed than there are guardrails to stop the abuses of this statute.
You want to know who's fighting for your gun rights? Gun Owners of America. GOA is the no compromise gun rights group, and I urge you to become a member at gunowners.org. Now, what have they done? Well, GOA secured a preliminary injunction against the ATF pistol brace rule. GOA members submitted a record 85,000 plus comments opposing the ATF's universal registration check rule. They helped enact permitless carry in Nebraska and Florida. GOA secured victories in California, Illinois, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Plus, they won 2 legal victories against the ATF's zero tolerance policy. And GOA fought to overrun Joe Biden's ban on funding hunter education, shooting sports, and archery in schools. With the constant attacks on our Second Amendment, we often ask ourselves, well, what can I do about it? This is what you can do. Become a member at gunowners.org and help us save the Second Amendment. With respect to the red flag laws, this past weekend, Joe Biden, I guess they just, I don't know if, I think it was through executive order, maybe you can tell me more. They created the National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center, which is where they're going to even push more to states, and maybe tell me a little bit about the $750 million they have allotted for incentive for states to get on board with these red flag laws.
Yeah, unfortunately, the money and the authorization for this comes from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was the gun control bill that was passed by Congress. And, this was one of the things, right, to encourage states to adopt red flag laws, to encourage the use of red flag laws in states where they already exist. What's really nefarious about this, Dan, I mean, beyond the fact that the DOJ has now set up an office to help, facilitate the use of these things, is that it's being run apparently through Johns Hopkins University.
Right.
And their, School of Gun Violence Prevention, whatever the heck it's called, that's funded by Michael Bloomberg. So this is another example, right? I mean, not only do you have the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which is staffed by gun control activists from, groups like Everytown. Now you've got another Bloomberg-funded entity that is, working hand in hand with the Biden administration to advance this anti-gun agenda. Now, is a Bloomberg-funded, research outfit, are they going to, caution not to use these things unless it is, clearly evident that somebody is posing an imminent risk of harm to themselves or others? Or are they going to take that point of view that, these laws should be used as often as possible. It should be as easy as possible to take somebody's guns away, and it should be as hard as possible for them to get their guns back.
Yeah, exactly. And also the data that they come up with is so skewed. I mean, look at the CDC's data during the Obama administration with defensive gun uses. They came up with, I think, 1.6 million defensive gun uses, but they didn't like that and they didn't want to show it to the public. So they, so they'll skew things, so they won't show you certain information. But I don't trust anything that comes out of that Bloomberg organization or any of those funded research studies, because they're all created for one thing: gun control.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And again, this is, the really frustrating thing, besides the assault on our fundamental right to keep and bear arms, is that, we really do have a mental health issue in this country. Suicides were at an all-time high last year.
Yeah.
This is something that gun owners and non-gun owners alike are concerned about. But the way that you address this is through mental health, right? And one of the things that I think is so appealing about red flag laws to lawmakers is that it allows them to say they're doing something without addressing the shortage in inpatient beds, without addressing the shortage in mental health facilities. In Virginia, where I live, for example, if somebody's in a mental health crisis, they can end up spending 24, 48 hours sitting in an emergency room or sitting in a jail cell because there's no other place for them to go because the state doesn't have the space to put them in a hospital where their crisis can be addressed, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge problem. But rather than fixing it, what do Democrats want to do? Well, they want to expand the red flag laws.
Yeah.
You know, it is so infuriating to me that they are taking such a casual and callous approach. They are exploiting this real issue that we have in this country to advance their anti-gun agenda. Red flag laws, again, they don't help anybody who's in a mental health crisis. And I think if for no other reason, even if you're not a gunner, even if you're not a fan of the Second Amendment, you should reject these laws because they are fundamentally at odds with their stated purpose, right? We're told these things are about saving lives, about helping people in a crisis. No, they do nothing to help somebody in a crisis. They just take their guns away.
Yeah, you know, and I'll say it. I don't know if you're willing to say it, but I'll say it. I believe the political left, without these tragedies, without the mental health issues, without all the stuff that causes death and destruction, often when a gun is used, I believe that they don't want to see this stuff go away. They capitalize on it because they can push for more gun control measures when this stuff. I don't think they care about the kids dying in the schools because every time it happens, due to Joe Biden's Gun-Free School Zones Act as part of the Crime Control Act in 1990, when it happens, they capitalize on it and they push for more gun control. So I'm
never
done.
let a crisis go to waste, right? That's what
Exactly.
Rahm Emanuel said. Yeah, and it is that type of attitude. So, you know, listen, I'm sure that there are people in the gun control movement who truly do care, and they just have really bad ideas. But I think that you're right. I think that there is a certain number of gun control activists, and I think the higher up in these organizations you get, the more likely you are to find those folks who are perfectly fine with these things happening because they believe it helps their agenda. Now, I'd say they're wrong, Dan. I mean, when you look at how they jump and seize on every tragedy, and then the lack of legislative success that they're seeing, right? You know, Lewiston, Maine, for example. I mean, they've been calling for, red flag laws, 72-hour waiting periods, ban on so-called assault weapons. And they were doing that before we knew anything at all about the circumstances of the shooting in Lewiston. They do that because that's what they're told to do. That's how they get their way. And yet the governor in Maine did not advance any of their proposals. Democrat lawmakers have introduced these bills. It's unclear as to whether or not they're going to pass. There's been a lot of pushback in Maine. So I even think from a political perspective, what they're doing doesn't make a lot of sense. But from a moral perspective, it's absolutely disgusting. It's reprehensible.
Well, you think, and I think you made me think about this, yeah, because you'd think that they would say, wait a minute, this isn't working. People aren't buying it. But there are people who are buying it. I mean, there are anti-gunners living among us who just cheer them on. Oh, good. Assault weapon ban, magazine restriction, another gun-free zone, whatever it is. Regardless of the reality and the results, like John was saying, what are the results of this policy? Regardless of it, there are people who will still cheer this stuff on. Yeah. I think it's because they're just cheering for their team. It's just insanity.
I think you're absolutely right. And they will cheer this stuff on. And then when you turn around and you ask them, well, what do you think about over-policing? I think it's horrible. What do you think about mass incarceration? Oh, we need to get away from that, right? I don't believe, and yet they then turn around on a dime and say, but
Right.
if you own that gun, yeah, you should go to prison. If you own, that magazine, you should go to prison. If you carry in this gun-free zone, you should go to prison. At the same time, they don't seem to be all that upset about armed robbers or carjackers or home invaders walking away with probation or a slap on the wrist.
Right. You guys have comments?
Was he in Virginia?
Yeah.
Didn't they just pass a stupid law there that said that it's unconstitutional to pull someone over of color? Obama's judge just put that in.
Go ahead.
I'll have to go back and look. I have not seen that. It is entirely
it just popped
possible.
up today.
Okay, it's entirely
So
possible.
now, in Richmond, I think they said you can't pull over someone of color because it's unconstitutional because less white people are being pulled over.
Somebody got to even it out.
Like, where are
Gotta
we?
be
What are we doing? What are we doing here?
He's a
Well,
racist.
thankfully, that'll be one of the many bills that Governor Glenn Youngkin will veto this session. But I got to say, I mean, living in Virginia, it's crazy. Democrats have a 1-seat majority in the House and the Senate, and they're acting like this is Albany. They're acting like this is California. They're passing bans on so-called assault weapons. They passed a waiting period bill. They passed over 30 gun control measures this session, all of which I think are likely to be vetoed by Governor Youngkin. But yeah, they're not acting like they're moderates. They're not acting like, they scraped by a legislative majority by the skin of their teeth. They're acting like they have this mandate to move the state as far left as possible. And again, I don't think that's unusual for Virginia. I think that's just the state of our politics right now. Where Democrats take power, they will do whatever they can to try to enact their agenda as quickly as possible. And so, a purple state like Virginia could turn deep, deep blue in terms of its laws very quickly if voters are not aware and if they're not active and engaged.
Absolutely. And I got to say one thing, though, about Virginia. Like with Virginia Citizens Defense League, our friends over there, and Virginia gun owners, I mean, they fight back. I mean, the gun owners are fighting back on all this stuff. I'm sure you remember the big rally a few years back. And then we were recently, you and I were both at this, at the lobby day, just a couple months ago, January. So the gun owners go ahead.
Yeah, I was there in 2020 at that massive rally where there were, 30 to 50,000 people just filling the streets of downtown Virginia. Speaking of that rally was just, it was one of the highlights of my life. I will never forget looking out at that sea of people as I was standing in front of the Capitol. And, you're right, Dan, this year, the numbers weren't there. I think because gun owners believe, all right, well, we have Youngkin as a backstop, right? So I don't necessarily need to show up in Richmond. But I hope to God they're still contacting their state reps, their state senators, because this problem has not gone away. And I am concerned that there are some gun owners in Virginia who have gotten a little complacent, who are not aware that the threat is as real as it is. And we are one election away from becoming California or Connecticut or New York or Massachusetts or New Jersey.
Well, I hope that doesn't happen. But Cam, it's great talking to you, and I really appreciate you being on the show. Is there anything that you want to plug? Where can people find you? What's your call to action these days?
Yeah, absolutely. I just encourage folks, check out bearingarms.com. We are constantly updating the website with the latest Second Amendment news and information. We do Bearing Arms Cam and Company every Monday through Thursday. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Rumble, all the major podcast platforms. I want to thank you for the invite, Dan. This was a great conversation. I hope to get a chance to come back. We got to have you on Cam and Company soon.
Anytime. Just let me know. I'm happy to do it. I'd love to. Thanks. Thanks so much, pal. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much for watching the Loaded Mic. What a great interview with Cam Edwards. Thanks for watching us on Rumble and YouTube. You can also find us on the OpsLens Network, Right America Media, Simul TV, the Key Radio Network, and the podcast. Anywhere you get your podcast, you can find the Loaded Mic. We're there. I'm Dan Woss, and the Second Amendment is not a privilege. It's your right.